Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do pretty much every Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down in the comment section below the video. That's where we pick from each week. I've got 20 some for this week and already on to almost an entire another video's worth of questions from the last couple. So there'll probably be an extra question and answer video at some point coming up. Been consistently putting up these videos from the Garden Plants with Jim Putnam channel and adding a few new ones in that are just our new content. There was also a video on Friday about leaving leaves in your garden. That's the 5-minute Friday video that I've started doing. There'll be one of those hopefully every Friday. I've got a couple other things I've shot. I just haven't gotten around to editing, so it's been mostly these single plant videos. Recently, we've got well, within the questions here, there'll be a couple other things about content that's coming up pretty soon. And we're actually in northern Arizona right now in a pine forest. Really kind of beautiful area near Kingman, Arizona. It's kind of an interesting area. If you're in a valley here in this part of Arizona, it's just, there's hardly anything. The wind blows through some of these valleys and there's some grass and it's cows. It's way more cows than people. But then you get into one of these slightly mountainous spaces like this, and they can be really beautiful forest with a lot of different plant species in them. When we're obviously here in the fall, there's some oaks over here that are losing their leaves. That's one of the reasons we stopped here, because I was shooting the 5-minute Friday video on the leaves. So let's jump into some questions from this past week and the week before. Somebody's in zone 8A, North Carolina. Does Loropetalum tolerate hard pruning reset? Yes, and I've shown that on the channel. If you want to go back through, there's a lot of pruning videos on the channel over the years, and I have shown that Carolina Midnight Loropetalum at the house being really severely chopped. Even last year, probably last year, if you want to go back and look at that. But we do it after it blooms, so keep in mind your Loropetalum is carrying its flower buds through the winter. It will bloom a little bit in the fall. You'll get a few frilly flowers on your Loropetalum, some, usually in the fall, and then the heavy flowering will be sometime in 8A, North Carolina, probably sometime as early as mid-March, almost certainly. And then after that flowering is when you do the hard pruning on it. I wouldn't do it before that. The top of that foliage is going to offer some protection to the plant during the winter time. And you'll be cutting the flowers off if you pruned it now. Number 2, do you have videos on native plants for North Carolina, Southeast, any plan to? There is a playlist on the channel called Native Plants. And so if you go through the main HortTube with Jim Putnam channel, and hit the playlist button, you'll see all the playlist, and all these single plant videos are going into lots of different playlists, but one of the playlists is native plants. I don't know how many videos are in that playlist, probably close to 100 over the years. If you're interested in learning about native plants that I've covered on the channel, I do have them in a particular place. With that said, the expansion of the Raleigh garden that's coming is going to be almost entirely native, and so you guys will see that hopefully in upcoming content toward the beginning of the year is the big plan for that. And I imagine we'll be putting in lots of native plants down in the Wallace garden as well. Somebody asked about propagating native possum haw holly. So there's a possum haw viburnum, and then there's a possum haw holly. We love to reuse names and common names so to confuse people. Will they sprout from seeds or berries or from cuttings? So here's the thing. Possum haw holly is Ilex decidua, which is a great, that species name is just perfect because decidua means deciduous, that loses its leaves. It's one of the hollies that's actually a deciduous holly, which there are several of our native hollies are actually deciduous. The vast majority of hollies we use in our ornamental landscape are evergreen, but there are deciduous ones, and Ilex decidua, or possum haw holly, is one of those. So you can do them from seeds or berries. You do need some cold treatment, so you can take them and just scatter them and then get the cold treatment, hopefully during the winter time, or you can, this is a southern native, and so a lot of times when we're trying to do seed from something, you need to kind of look at where that plant is from. And so being that this is a southeastern native up to maybe southern Indiana, so it goes up there pretty far, but for the most part down from southern Indiana south to the Gulf, it doesn't need a lot of chill hours. It doesn't need a lot of time for the seed to be cold, but it does need some period of time for the seed to be cold for it to germinate. So you could do it that way, but I think the overall easiest way is to do them from cuttings in all likelihood, and that would probably best be done in May or June when that spring flush has flushed, it's finished flowering, and then that new growth is kind of semi-hardened off a little bit. That's the best time to take those cuttings on it. What you'll get from a cutting is a clone of that parent plant. And so if you're looking at taking cuttings off ones from somewhere, pick the best parent plant you want to take cuttings off of, because it's going to be a clone of that plant. From seed or berry, it's some sort of mix of where bees and other things it's mixed pollen, and it could be a tall thin one mixed with a short stout one or whatever. You know what I mean? The seed is going to be variable, is my point. If you have one and it looks great, you're best to clone it by taking a cutting. Okay. What is the best way to mulch an iris bed, considering you shouldn't cover the rhizomes? And that's a good point, is that you shouldn't really cover the rhizomes, but you can end up with kind of a weedy mess. It's going to depend partly on where you live as whether or not you can mulch an iris bed, where the rhizomes are just sitting right on the top of the soil. So if you're in an area that drains really well, like in coastal North Carolina or South Carolina or wherever the soil, it's not wet potentially during the winter time, you can get a little more aggressive and mulch them a bit, okay? In an area where I'm at, where there's maybe more clay soils, or it's an area that may stay just a little bit more moist during the winter time, I'm going to avoid mulching them because I'm going to potentially rot them during the winter time. So that's partly on where you live. And then if you do mulch, I would mulch with something like pine straw that will allow for some air movement around and within the pine straw. Where if you mulch it with something that's heavy and thick, compost or something like that, it's going to potentially keep them too wet. So it's a good question. Partly depends on where you live, and then the material you use should breathe in some way if you're covering them at all. So somebody asked whether close to minimum or maximum of a plant zone, how does that affect light requirements? For instance, a plant that grows from zone 4 to 9. This is a really good question and it's hard to cover on a channel. I always get, I put up a video, I'll put up a video and the person says, well, it's not like that here. It's really hard to cover a plant for every possibility of where it will grow. The conifers will grow in zone 9 potentially in Oregon or Washington State, but wouldn't grow anywhere near zone 9 in Texas. It's really hard. There's some variation in just what is your summer highs. That has when we're talking about zone 4 to 9, we're only talking about the low temperature. The high temperature is going to matter as well, right? And so, when I'm doing one of these single plant videos, it's really hard to tell everybody everywhere how it's going to perform, in their gardens. But conifers are a good example of that, where some of them aren't going to do zone 9 in the southeast, but they'll do zone 9 in the Pacific Northwest. But so light requirements though are different, and definitely on something, we can go way up in the north and see hydrangea macrophylla or big leaf hydrangeas in the absolute full sun, in upstate New York somewhere or in Ontario, and then come back down to Raleigh, North Carolina, and if it's like that, they're going to be in really bad shape by middle summer if they're in the full sun. So there is definitely variability in the amount of sunlight something can take the further north you go. There's no question about that. It's going to be different for different plants. And most plants that are hard, if there's like a 4 or 5 zone difference in that plant, almost certainly there's going to be some variability in how much afternoon sunlight that plant can take the further it goes south. Number 6 is Mahonia aquifolium alkaline tolerant. Yes, very much so. We are in Arizona now, but throughout, probably even still here, but certainly up through all of Utah, you'll see Oregon great polys, and then of course, all up into the Pacific Northwest. They grow differently depending on where you are. If you're in an area that has a little bit more, probably slightly more acidic soils and a little more moisture, they can be pretty full, interesting interesting ornamental plants when we see them sometimes in a place like Utah growing next, under a shady kind of cliff space, and they're not getting a lot of moisture. They're very diminutive little things, and they'll grow in that limestone, and just as well as they'll grow in those acid soils up in the Northeast. But yeah, they are alkaline tolerant. So zones are pH of anywhere from probably 5 to 8 is no problem at all, but it probably will create some difference in its, in its overall growth habit of not having that iron available. Potentially seems to stunt them just a bit. Water as well stunts them just a bit. Let's see. Charleston, South Carolina, established clay grows 3 to 4 feet each year, and they will. A lot of the larger growing Clarea japonicas will grow. And that's the thing with plants, is you put it in the ground, it grows 3 inches the first year or not at all. And then 6 inches the second year or only 3 inches, whatever. And then by the 10th year, it's growing 3 and 4 feet a year. And then things get out of control pretty quickly. These are on their foundation, and their foundation's only 3 foot tall. So imagine something that's trying to grow an extra 3 feet every season. They're pruning on them constantly. It's a part shade to shade space, so they're considering a different route using something like Farfugium and variegated Carex. Is that a good idea? Sure. Here's the thing about a good idea. It's really whatever you like. Whatever will grow in the area that you live in, that will meet the requirement of staying below your 3 foot foundation, and you like it. There are no wrong answers whatsoever. So if you're drawn to Farfugium, and I really like Farfugium, and there are variegated ones and ones that look like lettuce, and then tractor seat plants, and like all kinds of cool Farfugiums. And now we know with variegated Carex, there's just so many great variegated Carex, and they'll be perfect plants for that space for you down in Charleston. Your Farfugium, most winters will stay almost evergreen in Charleston. Some winters they'll probably get killed back a bit to the ground. Do daffodils attract pollinators? Originally, yes, daffodils definitely attracted pollinators. Anything with that showy of a flower would have been useful for pollinators for sure in the early season. But hybridization, there's been so much hybridization in them that we've kind of lost the important parts in most of the named daffodils. But that's not 100% true. There are lots of daffodils out there that do attract them, and honeybees tend to be the main things that will come to daffodils. So it's really what varieties that you have. So it's going to be a variety to variety difference on the whether they're good for pollinators or not. Probably should turn my back occasionally, make sure a mountain lion is not in my general vicinity, right? Okay, let's see. Number 9, dividing hellebores. Some people say they don't like it. You can absolutely divide hellebores once they've gotten to a state where I would divide them when they're producing large leaves and they've been in the ground for a while, and they're pretty. They're ones that are really growing well and thick, and just not something that's diminutive and has been struggling. You know what I mean? So that would be they had read that they don't like it. And there's a lot of things that don't like necessarily to be divided, but certainly once your hellebores get to the point where they're crowding themselves out, you can pop them out of the ground and divide them. You can do it during the now, this time of year, or wait until they have flowered in the early spring if you want to do that. But I don't mind, I'll dig anything out of the ground and give it a go. And most of these things, most of these rumors about this thing doesn't like to be moved, and that thing doesn't like to be divided, and that thing doesn't like to be, I'm sure a lot of them are absolutely true. But I'm also thinking that sometimes somebody moved something and then they started the rumor because it died on them. And, I've moved things and it died, and then moved the next one of the same thing and it didn't die. Sometimes things are going to go wrong. And you have to kind of accept that. If you're going to stick a shovel in the ground and start moving plants around, splitting plants in half, dividing bulbs, whatever you're going to do, sometimes it's not going to go great. That's just life in gardening, right? Somebody bought 10 purple daydream loropetalums in zone 8A, North Carolina. Sandy soil. Should they plant them now or the spring? I definitely plant them now in zone 8, because they're much better off in the ground than they are in that container. The roots are really vulnerable to being frozen solid. It's one of the few things there. I don't want to say few things. If you follow nurseries throughout the country, you'll see less and less plastic covering as you go toward the Gulf, and more as you move north. By the time you get to nurseries that are in New Jersey or even upstate Virginia, most of them will be putting a lot of their material under plastic covering in the winter. But even in the South, a lot of the loropetalum is going in the houses in the winter, because if the containers freeze solid, they are damaged. So get those roots protected, get them in the ground. But keep in mind, the first winter you're planting a loropetalum in the fall like this, you may need to cover them if you're going to get some abnormal cold nights during the wintertime. Are clay soils usually acidic with high organic matter versus sandy soils being alkaline? No, that's really, really all over the place. There are, because eastern North Carolina, eastern South Carolina, and around to Florida, and the sandier soils along the southeast have very alkaline soils. They were pine forest, for a long time, and it rains like crazy, so it washes the lime out of that sandy soil. So very acidic sandy soils there. So I don't know that you can go based on the type of soil that you actually have as to whether it's going to be acidic or alkaline. It's really, again, I've talked about this maybe even last week. A lot of it has to do with the historic rainfall of that area. And if you look at a pH map of the U.S., if you look at the Pacific Northwest, I think Oregon and Washington are a great example of this. If you look at Western Oregon, Western Washington on the pH map, you'll see that they're very acid near the coast, and then very alkaline toward the eastern part of the states, where it doesn't rain as much. Just so within a single state, you can see that difference. And then if you look at where the most acid soils are in the southeast United States, Michigan, where it rains a lot, and then the places like around where there's heavy snowfall, potentially like around Denver, that kind of thing, and then Pacific Northwest. If you look at that on the map, it kind of shows up as, wow, it's the places where it rains a lot that typically have more acid soil, with exceptions. And then, of course, again, I don't think you can judge it necessarily on the soil type. Number 12, this person's been really dry in 7B, Maryland, and boy, a lot of the country has been really dry. Plants look ragged. Would hose watering be advisable? Is it worth a large water bill? So, I don't want the plants to get slammed with cold necessarily while they're extremely dry. If they're already in a kind of a condition where they're not overall happy, it may be advisable to water. Hopefully, before we get any extreme cold, you have gotten some rain where you are, and it won't matter as much. But this is one of those things that's, again, this weekly garden planner, I bring it up a lot, but this is what we're building in the weekly garden planner, is talking about this time of year. This October, November period of time can be quite dry for quite a bit of the country. And you may need to take action, especially if you're planting new things. Your existing things that just kind of look ragged, that are already established in the garden, they'll probably make it through the winter just fine. But they would probably be happy with at least a little bit of water between now and the time they get a heavy, hard freeze on them. Somebody's in 8A Atlanta, they're red twig dogwoods. They've moved them all over the landscape, sun to part, shade to shade. They never look good. Leaf fungus, no blooms, no vibrant red, just not good one for the South, ? Yeah, this is the case with red twig and yellow twig dogwoods. We'll have the occasional one. It's weird because I say this, but if I walk around Raleigh enough, I will see a few red twig dogwoods that look pretty good. And there's a lot of plant breeding to make them more heat tolerant going on. So we may see in time some introductions that are a little better for the South, but the red twig dogwoods look much better in the Northeast and northern places in the country, or places that just don't get as hot during the heat of the summer. They just overall look better and have less of a lot of those other issues. Somebody has an Asahi aspidistra, 1 year old, that has no variegation. Asahi is a cast iron plant that has white on the tips, and this is one we have in our garden. It took us 2.5 years to get the first leaf that has a really good white tip on it. So that's no big deal at all. And then, and they have a spider's web fatsia that doesn't have a lot of variegation on it. And they just heard aspidistra won't show variegation if fertilized too much. Prefer organic fertilizer in spring. Would it be wise to not fertilize, or will they show variegation next year? They're in 9A Florida. I think it's just going to take time in the ground overall, and then just use an organic fertilizer in that late winter, early spring period of time, so you're not fertilizing a whole lot, you know, and it won't be an issue of having pushed them too much. Spider's web fatsia, I haven't seen two that looked alike yet. And I occasionally see ones that are definitely more green. I see some that are definitely more variegated. I don't know, they're being done from tissue culture and not cuttings. And I'm wondering if there's just some genetic drift that's happened in them a little bit. But make sure if you're buying one of those things that has some good white variegation on it when you buy it. But I don't think either one of these problems have anything to do with you having over-fertilized them. Let's see. Can you use sawdust in place of wood chips? So if you were starting a garden in the style that I've talked about a bunch of putting down a layer of wood chips and letting that break down and become humus, and then, you know, then mulching over that in the future with some sort of more decorative mulch, just as a jump start for your garden, sawdust will probably not replace that very well. It'll work fine as a top mulch in your garden without any problem. It won't cause you any issues. But they dry those trees out before they, before they saw them. And so those trees will sit, you know, on those piles for a long time. And they may spray water over the top of them to make sure that the water leaves the tree uniformly and they don't crack as much. But they are dried quite a bit before they're milled into lumber. And so the issue there is that there's no green in it. So when I order a load of wood chips from Chip Drop or wherever I'm getting wood chips from, it's the whole tree chipped up. So I would get from this pine tree back here, I would get all the pine needles, the limbs, the stems, all the green parts of the living part of the wood that's, you know, alive in the edges of the tree. So I would have this mix of greens and browns together. And that combination is what allows things to compost and cook down rather quickly. If it's just the sawdust, okay, and I'm not getting the green part of the tree, I'm not getting any of the needles or the leaves or any of the living parts of the tree, then that material is going to break down really, really slowly in the garden. It will break down, but I would think about, if you had access to sawdust and you wanted to use it for something, I might use it as a decorative mulch, or I might use it as pathway. Probably an excellent thing for using as pathways in your garden, like what I use wood chips. The sawdust may be even better for pathways because, it may break down just a hair slower, but it's missing some of the value that you get in getting wood chips, which is the whole tree, rather than just the wood part in the center of the tree that's been dried out. Can you put a thin layer of wood chips to slowly build up? Yeah, absolutely. You can just slowly, just like any mulch. It wouldn't matter whether it's wood chips or hardwood mulch or whatever you're using mulch-wise. If you're putting a little bit each time, you're going to build humus in time. The deep wood chip method, and this person asked me if I had watched the Back to Eden stuff, and I have. The deep wood chip method builds soil really quickly. So by doing it a layer at the time, over time, as an example of that, 23 years I lived in the old house, and I built maybe this much humus over the years of mulching it, because I moved in there and just started using mulch, and I was using the city of Raleigh's mulch and leaf mold and all those kinds of things, and I built up a pretty decent humus layer over the time I was there. I improved that soil quite a bit. I've done equal to that in 1/5 the time doing the deep wood chip method at the new house. So that'll give you some idea. It just puts everything, it just speeds up the clock by doing the deep wood chip method. Somebody has Emerald arborvitae, 4 years old, with inner brown needles. Why and what to do? So Conifer's thin this time of year. Even these pines right now have lots of brown needles on them. This is high fire time, out west and in other places, because these pines are in the process of shedding needles. It's just normal on conifers. They'll actually try to put on a little bit of growth in the cool season times of the year, and they'll shed some interior needles to do that. Where you're seeing it in excess this year is related to being dry. And so, you know, it's another thing on the weekly garden planner that I can keep pointing out here is that, you know, we would recommend on conifers, and this is one of the videos, it's in the weekly garden planner, you know, in the fall, water those conifers some, even if you don't think they need it, if you know it's dry outside, even if it's an old established one, because once they're going to thin every fall a little. When it becomes excessive, that's telling you it's also dry. You've got dry on top of the time of year they shed anyway. Somebody has a Carolina Sapphire, Arizona Cypress, Topiary, and I'm in Arizona right now. When you see the Arizona Cypress here, they're kind of funny. They're diminutive in comparison to what they are back in Raleigh and in the eastern and southeastern part of the country, where they like to get if they have a little bit of water, they actually grow big and full, and here they're it's a tougher life in their home range here, in their native range. It's a topiary that they will continue to shape and control. They planted it 2 feet from the foundation of the house. Will this ever be an issue? Yes. All plants will eventually be an issue. So I can answer this for every question I will ever get. Will this ever be an issue? Yes. Almost every ornamental plant that you put into your landscape that's not like a shade tree or something, you'll eventually want to replace it or hard prune it or cut it out in some way or another. Everything gets tired eventually. But with this Carolina Sapphire, what will eventually happen is I think it'll just look weird. You just keep, topiarying it, and the trunk will get bigger and bigger, and it'll eventually just probably look weird. That's a long time from now, so I'm just not going to stress about it. In the meantime, what may again happen is the longer it's in the ground, the more roots it's going to develop, and the faster it's going to grow. Just like we were talking about with that clay era earlier. Boom. So right now you're out there cutting it into a topiary, and it's pretty easy because it's growing pretty slow. As it gets more established, it may be a lot more frequent pruning on it to keep it that way. Number 19, Zone 6B, can butterfly bushes be transplanted in the fall? Yeah, you can transplant them pretty much any time you'd want to transplant them. If you're asking me the best time, probably in Zone 6B. I do it coming out of winter. As you're starting to see a little growth along the stems on the bottom of it, you can cut it back at that exact same time and move it at that time, and that's probably the best time to do it. But again, it's a butterfly bush, and you can probably park your car on it and get away with it. Number 20, Zone 8B. They have a long fence. Wants a holly as a screen, mostly sun. What are the best screening hollies? Any of the upright hollies are great, especially any of the self-fruiting ones, but I really like Christmas jewel holly. I don't recommend any kind of long fence that you put all of the same thing all the way down the fence. I've mentioned this a bunch of times. You might want to look at my video on screening plants using a mixed border screen and not using the same thing. Because if you were to get some sort of problem in that area, what would happen? I got another van driving past me here, and their license plate says Vanna White. That's kind of funny because they're in a RV van that's white. So a van, a white. That's kind of funny. But if you ended up with some sort of issue in that screen, like this person who's, Emerald Arborvitae are 4 years old. I don't know if they have some long line of them, but if they did end up with a massive issue here, they'd lose their whole screen. So if it were me, I would look to do other sorts of leafy evergreens if you have that opportunity to do so, other than just hollies. And but I like Christmas jewel holly, screenplay holly, even Nellie Stevens, Oakland, variegated Oakland we have at the house. There's all kinds of great upright hollies that you can use for this purpose. I would blend some other things into it. We'll do a couple more questions here, and then I'll wrap this one up for this week. Somebody planted perennials, hosta, pulmonaria, heuchera, brunera, stilbe. Thought they would need lots of watering, so they did. They did it 2 or 3 times a week. They got smaller rather than growing. Is that a sign of overwatering or root rot? If it was overwatering or root rot, typically the plants would just die. And so I think that it's more likely underwatered. And I know that's hard to believe if you've watered 2 or 3 times a week, but it was extremely dry this year. And what I see typically on in dry shade, and especially this list is a very good clue for this hosta, pulmonaria, although pulmonaria tends to be a little more drought tolerant, but heuchera, brunera, stilbe, hosta, these are perennials that will get smaller on you in dry shade spaces. They'll go to sleep and come back the same size or slightly smaller the next year. It doesn't mean they want to be in wet areas, but it also doesn't mean they want to be just bone dry. They'll just get smaller and kind of shrink away in dry shaded spaces. They tend to like slightly more moist, evenly moist shaded spaces. And there's very different types of shaded spaces, and I've talked about that a bunch. Dry shade and moist shade are very different kinds of things. A lot of times your house will create moist shade conditions on that northeast and east kind of corner. Will be moist conditions, but out in your wooded area will be typically maybe a little more dry shade conditions, and you kind of got to have shade plants for those two different spots. But again, if it was overwatering or root rot, the plants just die. You don't get a second chance from overwatering things. You do get a second chance though from underwatering things, and you might want to consider moving them to a space that gets a little more moisture, or just allowing some time to go by here, and maybe they get themselves established in there and they're able to compete with whatever existing tree roots or whatever's there. All right, one more question here for this week. The weekly garden planner is linked down below if you're interested in purchasing that. And again, there's t-shirts over on the HortTube.com website as well if you're interested in that for upcoming Christmas season here. Somebody wants to, they're putting in a seed rack to grow their perennials and annuals seeds in 2 waves. Okay, so they have basically enough light rack to grow half of what they need to grow for the upcoming season. Is it better to start with perennials first because they take longer? We just divide our seed based on time to transplant. If you look at the back of any seed pack, whether it's a perennial or an annual or whatever it is, you look at the back of the seed pack, it will say time to transplant. That is the time it takes for you to put a seed into a tray. It's average, okay? Sometimes if it says 6 to 8 weeks, it might take 9 and it might take 5. Okay, but if you look on the back of the packet, if you look at something like peppers, it'll say 6 to 8 weeks. So wherever your average last frost date is, let's say that's April 15th for me, I can back up 8 weeks, and that's when I would start my peppers, because on the back of the package it says 6 to 8 weeks. Or I could just back up 6 weeks if I wanted to. So somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks it's going to take from putting that seed into that whatever plastic container you're growing them in, or whatever you're growing them in, putting them in the light rack, and then them being ready to put into the ground. So just take your average last frost date and back up that far. Then you'll flip over your tomato pack, and your tomato pack says 4 to 6 weeks, okay? And this is pretty typical of tomatoes. So you'd wait 2 weeks longer to start your tomatoes. Same thing with whatever perennials and annuals and whatever you're using. Just take the backs of the packs, see how long it says for the transplant time from seed to transplantable size, and then order your seed packs in that order. So for yes, as in general, a lot of the perennial flowering things that I show off on the channel and we have in our garden do take a little bit longer, but it won't be 100%. You'll probably end up with a few annuals in your early seed starting, and you'll probably end up with a few perennials in your later seed starting. But just organize them by how long it takes from starting the seed to transplantable size, and then look at your average your average frost date and back up from that. You're gonna find that you're not gonna be starting seeds until February in all likelihood for most people, but although most people, because they have some downtime, are gonna wanna try to start them in November and December and that kind of thing. But you're best to just look at your average last frost date and back up from that. So that's my strategy there. There is an entire playlist on the channel for seed starting as well. And there's another group of questions here to jump into another question and answer video. So thank you guys so much for participating. Ask questions in the comment section down below, and we'll pick from those next week. Thanks for watching.